Welcome, everybody. I'm really excited to see so many new faces joining us today. You are at the Frisch Center for Autism and Innovation's final Autistic Pride Month webinar for the month of April, and we'll get started in another minute to minute and a half, just so those folks who are logging on a moment late have the opportunity to join us and not miss anything. Feel free to throw in the chat, though, where you're from. I would love to know whether it's like an organization that you work for that's somehow related to this topic, or even just your home city and state or country if you're not from the US.
Oh my God, please. Come on, any more.
You will notice I'm sharing my screen. I'm going to go on and present our Meet the Speakers slide. So if this doesn't look familiar, hopefully you're at the right event. If you are not at the right event, you should stay, hang out. This is going to be super interesting. I would say if you know of anyone who wanted to join us today who was unable to, this will be recorded. So they will have the opportunity to listen in on this conversation after the fact. I will also say, just as a point of information, that all of our Frisch Center staff and representatives, including myself, are in Nashville, Tennessee. So that is where we are based at Vanderbilt University. And we're really excited to be the only university research center in the world that we are aware of that is really dedicated to neurodiversity in the workforce and empowering neurodivergent leaders in any workplace setting. So it's a privilege to have that sort of responsibility. And I'm seeing, oh great, we have Chief of Staff for Representative Benham with us coming in from Pittsburgh, and then Ben from Brooklyn, New York, who's a sibling of a self-advocate and wants to learn more. Amazing. We will go on and kick this off. I will state one more time for those who've just joined us, this is being recorded. So if that affects whether you want to ask a question publicly or privately, you can always during the Q&A message a question to me, and I'm happy to read it out without sharing your name. But I'm going to hand this over to our Frisch Center for Autism and Innovation Communications and Advocacy intern, Nicole Radke. She's a junior at Vanderbilt and has spent the whole semester working with us alongside another HOD intern named Ellie. And Nicole had the idea for this particular webinar, and she was the one who did a lot of the legwork to make it happen. And so I'm going to let her kick it off with some introductions and sort of lead us into our Q&A section. And we're going to begin by having some specific questions for each of these different sort of speakers or panelists, and then we'll move into an audience Q&A. So go ahead, Nicole.
Awesome. Hi, everyone. Thank you, Claire, and thank you, everyone, for joining us this afternoon. As Claire mentioned, my name is Nicole. I'm a junior at Vanderbilt, and this semester I'm one of the 2 advocacy and communications interns at the Frisch Center. So today we're really excited to be joined by 3 speakers who will be able to share their experiences as autistic adults working in politics and public service. Thank you to all of our speakers for being here. I'm just going to quickly introduce everyone and then we'll get started on our questions. Our first speaker, Jessica Benham, is a state representative in the Pennsylvania House representing District 37. Prior to running for public office, Jessica co-founded the Pittsburgh Center for Autistic Advocacy, where she is currently a director. This is a grassroots organization run by autistic people for autistic people. She holds a master's degree in communication studies from Minnesota State University. Heavily involved in Pittsburgh disability advocacy, Jessica was recognized in 2016 as an Autistic Scholars Fellow by the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network. Jessica is clearly dedicated to improving her community and advocating for the rights of autistic individuals. Today, we are also joined by Grace Hart. Grace Hart is a federal relations specialist at the University of Illinois Systems, where she advocates for higher education, affordability, and access, and increased funding for research and development. She recently completed a fellowship with the Self-Advocacy Research and Technical Assistance Center, which focuses on creating resources for autistic people looking to intern in the U.S. House of Representatives and the U.S. Senate. Prior to joining the University of Illinois System's Federal Relations team, she interned for her hometown Congresswoman, Terry Bustos, and disability champion, current Senator Bob Casey. She is currently earning her MBA from the University of Illinois Springfield. Welcome, Grace. And lastly, our last speaker is Claire Barnett. Claire is the communications director at the Frist Center for Autism Innovation. She's also my supervisor for this internship. Claire is a Vanderbilt University graduate and will be attending UNC's Keenan Flager School of Business in the fall to pursue her MBA. Claire has interned in the White House twice, one summer as a photo office intern and the next summer in the Office of Vice President's Communications Department. In addition, Claire has completed 2 semester-long internships for former US Senator Lamar Alexander in his Nashville, Tennessee office. Again, thank you to our speakers and our audience for joining us. As Claire mentioned, I'm gonna ask each speaker a few questions and then allow discussion to go from there. So if everyone's ready, let's get started. My first set of questions are to Representative Jessica Benham. So my first question is, as someone who campaigned for their position and had to do that very publicly, I was wondering what role your identity as an autistic adult played in your campaign.
Yeah, so being autistic is part of who I am. And so I think in many ways it played a role throughout the campaign, because when you are running for office, the campaign is very much about who you are and your lived experience and what you would plan to do for the district. And that was the case for mine, but I also tried to refocus to think about how we were building a movement in South Pittsburgh and in my district that was really based in supporting people and ensuring that in the midst of this pandemic, folks had access to the resources that they needed, and that we were providing for future economic opportunities for people as well. So certainly, who I am as a person plays a role in everything that I do. I always say that we legislate and we advocate from our lived experiences. But at the end of the day, my job as a state representative is to represent the people who live in the 36th district, and that is the work that I continue to do.
Thank you so much. Similarly, another question, I guess, about your campaign and your time in office. I was wondering if your identity as an autistic adult and was something that your constituents hadn't understood or had like a good understanding of what autism was, or something that you had to explain to your constituents either on the campaign trail or during your time in office.
That's a really good question, because I'm not actually certain. I mean, I definitely did not hide the fact that I was autistic. It was mentioned on several of the pieces of mail that we sent out to people in the district. I talked about it on my social media. But, when I was knocking doors or talking with voters on the phone, we were really focused on the issues that impact the district. And I think because those were the conversations that I was having with people, there just wasn't much discussion about me being autistic, honestly.
Okay, and then my last question is kind of asking about your organization, the PCAA, kind of how you founded it, and then your transition, what pushed you to run for public office after starting that organization? What was your big motivator and why you felt like something you were drawn to do?
Yeah, so the Pittsburgh Center for Autistic Advocacy is an autistic-run organization that's really focused on ensuring that autistic people in the Pittsburgh area have what they need to thrive. And so I partnered with a social worker friend of mine to found the organization. And, my colleagues as social workers provide a lot of those direct supports and services, which I think are really critically important. And I had been doing the advocacy and policy work there, which is equally important to ensuring the long-term ability of our community to thrive in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. And so my work had been in the policy arena, and I had always thought I would be on the other side of the desk, right? Advocating for the needs of our community, ensuring that we hold our elected officials accountable when they fail. And running for office was really not something that was in the back of my mind. And people in my community suggested to me that I should run. And I honestly laughed at the first person who suggested it. I was like, yeah, okay, the bisexual autistic girl should definitely run for office. That's a thing that people like me do. All right, yeah, I don't know about that. And I kind of laughed it off. But more and more people asked me to step up and run, and so I did. And this is not an easy job. My days are very long. I had a reporter follow me around to do a profile piece for about 5 days, and I joked that I broke him because I would be at the office, before 8 a.m. and I would be leaving after 9 p.m. This is not an easy job. It is not a 9 to 5 gig, but I love it. And so to step into this role, especially in this moment where there is so much need, when so many people are struggling, and I wish they weren't. I wish that we were not in a place where people are struggling as much as they are, just to simply make ends meet, to survive. But, and I'm a little religious too. I'm a pastor's daughter. So I really love the story of Esther and being called to serve in a time such as this. And that's how I think about my call from my community to step up and lead in this time, that they asked me to step into this role, that I'm in this role for a reason, and that the work that I do, especially now, especially during this pandemic, is meaningful and important. And so I just find it incredibly fulfilling. And like I said, there are long, difficult days, and I'm, juggling everything from helping folks with their unemployment issues to connecting people with vaccines to being in Harrisburg around people who have chosen not to wear masks, who have chosen to put the rest of us at risk. But I'm there to advocate for my community on the floor of the House and to vote on things that are really important and crucial to people's livelihood. And so it's amazing, rewarding work. I am very tired. I'm sure you can see the bags under my eyes. But at the end of the day, our frontline workers have been working tirelessly throughout this pandemic. And the work that I do to support them and to support our community is worth being a little tired for.
Thank you so much. It was a really great and inspiring answer. Is there anything, I'm going to move on to Grace. Is there anything else you would like to add about your platform or your experience before I move on to the next set of questions? I'm sure we'll all come back for a little more discussion towards the end, but if there's anything else to add in.
I rambled for a good bit there, but my platform has generally been focused on issues around healthcare, economic opportunity, education, the environment, and addressing issues of gun violence. Those have been my primary areas of focus.
Great, thank you so much. Okay, Grace, I have a few questions for you. So somewhat similar to the first question I asked Jessica, I was just wondering if you could kind of describe your experience working under an elected official, and if your identity as an autistic individual is something that you shared with the representatives you were working with, and something that they kind of understood.
Yeah, absolutely. So I interned for 2 different members of Congress. My hometown rep, Congresswoman Sherry Bustos, who represents the 17th District of Illinois, so like the northwestern part, not Chicago, and then Senator Bob Casey, who's actually a Pennsylvania representative, or no, senator, I'm so sorry. And both of these internships were extremely different, and working for both of these members of Congress was extremely different. In my first office, I was pretty open about being autistic. I had just gone to the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network's Autism Campus Inclusion Conference that summer. So I was really ramped up on Autistic Pride and excited to make a difference. And actually, intern and work in one of the offices that I had actually lobbied that summer. Because most of the people working in congressional offices are so young, they're really like between the ages of 22 and like 35. Most of them don't really think about disability as a big part of their life. And in the first office that I worked for, I was really open about it. I said that I really wanted to work on these issues if they ever came up. You don't really do a lot of legislative work when you just get to the office, and you're kind of low on the ranks. But there were certainly things that I could do just assisting on those tasks. And we didn't really do a lot of work in that space. And I think that's actually pretty typical of a congressional office. My experience in Senator Casey's office was completely different, actually. Both because it was a Senate internship versus a House internship. And that makes it a little bit different. You have like a big class of interns instead of just like, I think I was like one of 3 and I was the only full-time one. But there I actually wrote about my autism in my essay to apply for the program, and the intern coordinator said that it was like the most memorable essay that he had ever read, and I forgot that I had even written it about that at that point, because actually when I was at ACI, one of Senator Casey's staffers came in and spoke to us, and because networking is so big on Capitol Hill, you have to meet as many people as possible, and really like build your reputation, build those network of people who are willing to have your back when you apply for jobs and stuff. I met with that same staffer, and like I don't think that was like the most vulnerable I'd ever been in years, was like talking to this staffer about my history, about being diagnosed at 20, and having to leave my original college program, which was music education, due to some accessibility failures on my university's part. And I learned later that the biggest reason that I got that position in Senator Casey's office was because this staffer really had my back and said, we really want her. And then throughout the internship, I continued to be pretty open. I was allowed to wear my noise canceling headphones while I worked, and my productivity shot up. I was like doing 3 or 4 times more work than everybody else in the same amount of time. And I, could take walks throughout the Capitol. I always got there a little bit early to go around the tunnels and stim in the basement. But even though this program was cut short because of COVID, it was in the spring of 2020. They had already asked me to start working on a few disability related projects. And the experience of being open in both offices, and in one being kind of ignored, and still being really appreciated for like my work as an intern, but like not being as valued for my expertise in this area, versus getting to really put my heart into my favorite issue in the other office was I don't know, like it was almost I don't think life-changing is like the right word, but it was like it was just so encouraging to know that I could have that in a workspace, and that's something that at jobs that I've applied for, and at jobs that like I've looked at applying for, and graduate school programs, that's something that I really value and don't take for granted.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I think just like kind of a follow-up to that, just you mentioned that you were working on some disability advocacy or policy related projects during this internship. I was wondering if you could go a little bit more into like what those projects were and what you were focused on.
So the main one that they wanted me to focus on was on their application process for interns, because they hadn't really, they said they didn't think they'd considered having interns with disabilities as much as they wish they would have. So they wanted me to go through their application process, their interview process, and even like the actual form that they used online, to make sure that it was as accessible as possible. This was something I didn't really get to see through because it was cut halfway through. But I really appreciated like just having that passion of mine taken into consideration. And I also got to, because I said that I liked disability issues, just like the day-to-day projects of writing letters back to constituents, and going to briefings and hearings. I was asked more frequently to go to disability themed ones and write disability letters, than other letters, which was really great.
Okay, nobody asked me to jump in here, but I love the fact that I'm just going to offer a thought. Grace, I love the fact that as you had that experience, you told them that was something you cared about. And so they allowed you to then connect with constituents on those issues. And I guess I just wanted to point out that that stands in contrast to scenarios where maybe somebody is an expert in something other than their own disability, and they just get pigeonholed in disability stuff because that's all people see in them. So I don't know, that can happen two ways, but I love that in this scenario, you got to express that that was something you were passionate about because of your experiences, and that was why they had you pursue those projects instead of just saying, well, you're the disabled intern, you'll do that stuff. So anyway, Nicole, I'll toss it back to you. Do you have any other questions for Grace?
Not really. I mean, you kind of answered a lot of what I was going to ask. I was wondering if you had anything else you wanted to add in, or any other further thoughts.
Yeah, I'd actually like to talk a little bit about the role that I'm in now. I don't work directly on the Hill, but I work on a team of lobbyists for the University of Illinois. As it said in my bio, we advocate for increased affordability and access of higher education, and a lot of research funding advocacy. And in addition to thinking that we need more autistic people in politics, I really think that advocacy is also something that we can really shine in, especially since you can get really into like a specific issue if you're really into that. Like if you have a special interest, for example, like mine is birds. I love birds. My office only knows me online, so they have no idea like how intense this bird obsession is. But like say you're really into birds, you can just talk about bird legislation all day, and you don't have to worry about about anything else. And it can seem like all of politics is just like your little sliver of it. So if anyone's like looking for a career in politics and you're like, oh, I don't really want to go to DC, or a lot of federal people still end up in DC, federal advocates. But if you don't necessarily want to work like for the government, there's still a ton of options for you. And I think that I think we can really shine in a lot of areas of politics.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Okay, and then my last set questions I have are for Claire. So since from knowing Claire, I know this, but she completed one of her White House internships before her diagnosis and one after. So I just kind of wanted to hear her elaborate a little bit on what it was like completing one with before her diagnosis and then one after, and that shift, and if it was something that like really impacted her experiences in the White House.
Yeah, so hello again, everybody. I have gotten the opportunity to speak at several of our Autistic Pride Month webinars, so I'm really excited this time that we got to bring in some outside voices to kick off the conversation. But also there was something here I felt like I could add to this conversation, because I did, I had suspected I might be on the spectrum before doing that first internship in the White House photo office, but I didn't know for sure. I had not pursued it with any type of professional. And so I went into it just assuming that, that wasn't relevant. And the funny thing is, even before you know you're autistic, you still are. And so the way that I worked, interacted, and communicated the things I needed in a workspace, like those were still slightly different than other people because of my neurodiversity. And so that first summer, it obviously wasn't something I had put my finger on and disclosed to anybody because I didn't really know myself. But I still, for example, was a very literal and honest communicator. Or I was someone who had a little bit of trouble reading between the lines if an expectation or a deadline wasn't explicitly stated, or I was easily distractible whenever there was literally anything happening around the White House complex, that especially, sensory things, that because there's always some event, some visiting marching band. It seems like that happens a lot anyway. So that first summer, I had some trouble with my supervisor, which she shouldn't have been supervising literally anyone. She was not equipped to do that, just her own leadership skills. But we had communication difficulty that ultimately led to a complete breakdown of that like supervisor intern relationship, and then led me, when I got back to school that fall, to say, no, I should look into this autism thing, because the way that I communicated and her really strong negative reaction to it, for me, I was like, I'm just asking clarifying questions, or I'm just being honest, or nope, I'm reminding you what you told me and it sure wasn't that. For her, it was taken as somehow intimidating, or trying to assert that I was actually the person in charge, when in fact I was just confused about some misleading communication. And so I realized that there was something there I was missing in terms of reading between the lines, or how to communicate with her. And that was a big push, because I thought, I can't go my whole working life having this kind of difficulty with supervisors or coworkers. And so I got that diagnosis in fall after the first summer internship. And the second summer, when I went back, I had disclosed, immediately in my office, and not to everyone, because at that time I was still trying to figure out who I was as an advocate, but just to one supervisor. And it was kind of like what Grace described in her first internship. It really didn't come up. It was like that supervisor didn't really know what to do with it. And then later in the semester, noticed that supervisor from the first summer, who was now supervising a whole new class of interns. And again, as the chief White House photographer, I don't know why anybody put her in charge of interns, but that's, because there was a whole staff of photographers and editors. And I ended up reporting some of her interactions with me to the human resources person at the White House. And they, shifted in some ways how she was in charge of her staff, because what they realized was, even though I was saying, I reflect on it, and those are autistic traits that she could not sort of accommodate in any way. She was just really excited to assume the worst and to not give clear expectations, even when I said I needed them, despite at the time not knowing that that was an accommodation, just that it was a thing that I needed. And so this is turning into a long-winded story, but I say all that to say that having that difficulty spurred me onto the diagnosis. And even though I don't feel like it was in any way, I wish it had been a part of my role the second summer in communications for the vice president, but at minimum that second summer, I got to go back and say to someone who was kind of on the management side of that particular political organization, that there was someone there who was unable to accommodate and work with neurodivergent people. Because I watched that same pattern with an intern the next summer, who I was in a different office, but I was watching, and that intern was ADHD. And anyway, this could turn into an incredibly long monologue, but I guess I kind of got to advocate for myself in retrospect, which was, it was weird. Okay. Anyway, Nicole, is there anything else I can answer for you? I guess that was a strange experience. And I wish I had been a bit more out there, perhaps, with my identity as an autistic person the second summer, but I was pretty intimidated. And I've got to say, at the time, the White House didn't seem like the kind of place, sort of like Representative Benham mentioned, like this is not what autistic people do. And it's funny that I say that, because I ended up meeting up with other autistic White House interns, past and present. So I know that we actually do it. We've just been quiet about it.
Those are kind of all my questions. If anyone else has anything they want to add on what others have said, or I think maybe we could just talk about like what I was kind of wondering, kind of what role everyone believes autistic voices can play in politics in the future. And like, yeah, if anyone wants to answer that.
Yeah, well, I would love to piggyback on your question, Nicole, and direct one at Representative Benham, because that comment you made about how, like, obviously for you as someone who is autistic and bisexual, you thought, like, we don't run for office, nobody elects us. What do you think has fostered that sort of belief that it's not exactly a space where people with those differences feel welcome? And what do you think can change that in the future?
Well, I think our whole world is not built to make autistic people feel comfortable or welcome. I mean, there are very few spaces that are built specifically for people like us. And so as a result, whether we're talking about politics or we're talking about working in nonprofit spaces or corporations, living lives in our neighborhoods, participating in community groups, you know, whatever space we're talking about, they're typically not spaces where autistic people are celebrated, let alone explicitly welcomed. And I think we've all probably felt that pressure to fit in to a neurotypical world, right? And of course, there are certainly individuals who are very welcoming and supportive and enthusiastic about autistic people. But I'm talking about a system and a culture that doesn't really value us. And I think it's that system and that culture that makes it feel as though autistic people don't belong in places of power. And yet, I firmly believe that all marginalized people, whether we're talking about autistic people, whether we're talking about Black and Brown people, folks who are poor, LGBTQ people, et cetera, that all of us belong in the places where decisions are made that impact our lives. And so that's the argument that I make to people, that when we are talking about the critical issues that we're facing in my district, lack of access to economic opportunity, the devastation of landslides and flooding that's been exacerbated by climate change, lack of access to healthcare, and so on and so forth, that all of these issues are issues that disproportionately impact disabled people like me. And so as a result, I'm even more motivated to try to solve these problems. And so I think when we start to argue that our lived experience is actually valuable in these spaces, that having, in my case, a Pennsylvania General Assembly that is reflective of the diversity of our Commonwealth, that's a strength, that we need more of that. I think those are the arguments that we can begin to make. And I think we can make that case about any space, whether we're talking about interns at the White House or folks who are lobbying or whatever context in which we find autistic people, that our mere presence there at the table is important. But that in fact, at the end of the day, it's not just enough to be in the room where decisions are made. We have to be empowered to be an active part of that conversation and to be leading those conversations.
Great answer. That's exactly what I was getting at, and I wanted to sort of pick your brain on. And so this was the section of the program, sort of where we're shifting over into that Q&A. And so, this is the part where I was going to kind of help lead the discussion. And so I would love to sort of pose that question to Grace next, starting with Nicole's original question about sort of the future for autistic voices in politics, policy, government, but also just what you think has kept people out / will improve inclusion in the future.
Yeah, I actually think that the future for autistic people in politics looks really bright. When I was first diagnosed in 2017, when I was 20 years old, even then, only 4 years ago, the conversation around autism was a lot different. I've watched April become like something that I dreaded every year, to becoming like actually a month that does celebrate Autistic Pride. And I think a lot of that is just because we've become more outspoken advocates, and there's more people that are open, and there's more places for autistic community, because that's something that is really vital, not just to all autistic people, but I feel like me personally, in my success, I work in an extremely neurotypical space, like from like the associations we deal with to like my office in general is just really neurotypical. And I feel like lifted up by a lot of the people in the disability community that I call friends and mentors that I can always turn to for advice about, well, everybody does it this way, but I'm Grace and I'm autistic. How do I, what's something that's worked for you? And as far as barriers, there's a lot of barriers that people don't think of that I don't really even think fall under the realm of accessibility barriers. For example, like if you're working in an office and you read a form letter because someone contacts about, we want so-and-so to join the Autism Caucus, and you see that your office sends out a letter that's really ableist, actually, and includes a lot of information about, oh, this terrible disease, and it's terrible for children. They reference us as children. We need to do this for parents to eradicate it. Or you read things on official websites that really kind of hit you in the chest.
Oh my gosh,
And
Grace, the thing
still
you're
in
saying, I just want to say I've had a lot of those feelings throughout April, because you're right. It's this complicated mix of growing autistic pride and these not so much autistic voices that continue to say, like, let's solve this epidemic. And you're like, wait a second, what? But anyway, I wanted to say that I empathize a lot with that. And I think a lot of people in the community, you're putting into words what we've been feeling. So thank you for that. But anyway, feel free to keep answering the question.
Oh, I was pretty close to done. It was just that there's a lot of things in our, like, in official publications that are still really, really difficult to swallow. And that can discourage you from working in an office because you don't want to see that and hear about that every day. So yeah, but I think the more autistic people that work in these spaces, even if you're an intern or a staffer or a lobbyist or whatever, like, it's going to force the conversation to change. So even though it can be uncomfortable at times, I really think that more of us taking those leaps and being there for each other and being open about who we are while we're there, so we can find each other. Like you said, you found a bunch of White House interns. I didn't find any other interns on Capitol Hill.
Oh boy. Well, and it's funny. I had the privilege of having read Eric Garcia's piece online, and my understanding, Grace, is that Eric, and like just cold emailed him and got a response, and he connected me to other past White House interns who were on the spectrum, and so that one connection opened up this network. But anyway, again, your answer is it feeds into this idea that, for example, you, me, and Representative Benham are all coming from a different life experience, but there are these common threads of what it's been like to be particularly autistic women who have sort of had a foray into the public space of government and policymaking in some way or another. And my next question for y'all, and I would love to take audience questions too. So if you have one, feel free to put it in the chat, either send it to everyone if you want me to like read your name out with it, or send it to just me if you'd like it to be read out anonymously. But I guess what I want to know, and this is politics, but it's more like social construct than it is what's written into some law. We look at April and we look at autism advocacy, and I had this really frustrated moment lately where I realized that every time I go to TJ Maxx during April, they ask me if I want to donate to Autism Speaks, and I looked it up, and they've been doing that for 18 years. And I think a lot of us are familiar with some of the difficult things in Autism Speaks past, some of the things that have felt really devaluing of the community. And while I certainly can't say that everyone who supports them or works for them now is evil, there are some really troubling pieces that continue to make autistic people feel like we're trying to be cured or gotten rid of. So what does it take for a community of self-advocates to have the world listen to our perspective on how we want to be viewed, represented, supported, empowered? How many times have people written op-eds or raised their voices in a big conference setting to say, support self-advocates who are speaking, and instead nothing changes? So what is it going to take for that to shift? I don't know the answer. I'm asking. So if either of y'all have perspectives on the change to self-advocacy from more of that let's cure this terrible disease type discussion.
I mean, I think we're seeing the trend shifting. And I mean, I think I'm a little older than both of you, not by much, I don't think, but a little bit. And we really have seen a shift from, I mean, there was a time when you wouldn't get an op-ed placed in a mainstream newspaper. Like, I think that's really important context, right? Like, we have folks like Eric Garcia, for example, but there are many others who work in the media now who are openly autistic. There is news coverage that is written by and about folks like us, and there was a time when that wouldn't have happened. So I do want to celebrate that the neurodiversity movement is becoming more mainstream, because it has been. I mean, there was a time when that was not the case. And so I think we should celebrate that a little bit. Now, when it comes to how do we take that from, because I think we're in this space where people are like, yeah, neurodiversity is cool, that's good, but also autism speaks, right? We're in this space where folks are trying to find this kind of coexisting sort of model. How do we move to the next, where autistic voices aren't just part of the conversation, but really are considered to be leaders in the conversation? Neurotypical people need to step back from the conversation and need to prioritize the voices of autistic people. I don't think that there is more that autistic people can be doing. I think at this point, it's on the allies, it's on the neurotypical people and the non-autistic people to step back. And that's hard. I think about that, for example, on the question of race as well. It is really hard for white people to step back. But we have to find ways of decentering non-impacted people from the conversation. And that takes work from allies. It's not a fight autistic people can win.
That is such an excellent point. And I apologize for the power tools you might be hearing in the background. I mentioned this before we started the webinar, but unfortunately construction is happening where I'm living today. But anyway, you realize too, though, that there is a parallel here to other minority identities, that like we're trying to elevate those voices, where it's not that you remove the person who doesn't belong to that identity from the conversation entirely. It's just that they shift to a learning role instead of being in this place of needing to be the loudest voice in that conversation. So I think that is a wonderful answer. Grace, what do you think?
I think education specifically around accommodations is something that's pretty sorely needed in most workplaces as well. Because I think one of the biggest reasons that we don't work in politics, and we don't have a particularly strong employment representation like across the whole employment spectrum, is because most workplaces really aren't that accommodating. And this is like such a broad answer, but if things were just upfront meant to be accessible through universal design, or like just even not a treatment that you're receiving something extra by trying to kind of change the way other people work, then I think it would make it easier for us to get in more positions like Eric Garcia's in, and like you're in, Jessica. You're actually like a legend in the autistic space. I've heard so much about you. And we actually, if we were in person, my office would share an office with your alma mater, the University of Pittsburgh. But I think there needs to be more of that. And I think even if there were just more consequences for not providing accommodations to your employees, because really I can't think of any repercussions for anyone saying that because of my executive dysfunction, I can't do my job, and just trying to find another reason. And if I tried to, retaliate against that, it would probably be very expensive.
Yeah, and it's fascinating because I'm thinking on this big like society level, And in some ways, Representative Benham addressed that. But Grace, you talk about the everyday. Like if all of our workplaces are not well educated and realize that accommodation doesn't mean like we're going to pay you to do nothing. What it means is we're going to empower you to do what you are equipped to do when you have those accommodations. That I appreciate you sort of filling in the more day-to-day piece of what is it going to take for autistic people to have their voices heard. I mean, it's for people to understand what it even means when you say you're autistic. So I would love to read a few questions from our chat as well. And the first one is for you, Grace, from Tim Vogus, who is the Deputy Director for Business Innovations for the Frist Center for Autism and Innovation. And so Tim is a professor at Vanderbilt's Owen Graduate School, so the business school at Vandy. And Tim does a lot of research on neurodivergent inclusion in the workplace. And he appreciates the points that you've made, like being able to take a walk in STEM or wear noise canceling headphones or moving ableist language. But he's wondering what other ways you might think about making a workplace, he puts it as less neurotypical, which you always hear more neurodiversity friendly, but I like the idea that we can make our workplaces less neurotypical to increase inclusion and belonging. And can you think of anything, whether it's cultural or structural, that anything else that has benefited you that you've seen be good or that hypothetically you think would be really valuable in a workplace?
Oh man, they're all very specific and targeted. I think having more hybrid workplaces would be a big step towards making things more inclusive. I've thought a lot about what's going to happen when COVID ends and I have to go back to the office. And I was told that I could request working hybrid as an accommodation, and I'm like, doing it. And I also think that just in general, more structure. Oh my God. When you said, Claire, that like, if people don't like explicitly give you a deadline or like give clear instructions, that like you find that it's really difficult to like read between the lines. I feel you so hard, like in every single position that I've had. And that, I don't think that goes along with even being like more accessible. I think that goes along with being a good manager in general. Especially when you have young people in your office. So I always try to give a deadline and give really specific instructions and give reference documents. And I've noticed actually that it takes a lot more work on my end when I try to assign people things that way. But like I've always believed in like walking the walk, so I don't want to do that to our office as interns.
Yeah, well, and Grace, I think Yumi and Tim should probably have a meeting because I didn't realize you were also pursuing your MBA. I'll start mine soon, and Tim is a business school professor, so we're going to have a conversation about that. But I'm going to shift to the next question just in the interest of getting through these, and I want to hear all the responses. I'm quite excited. This could be for either of you, but I think it makes sense to address it first to Representative Benham. Dave Caudell, who is the executive director of our Frist Center for Autism and Innovation, says, one obvious challenge in politics is effective persuasive communication. Many on the spectrum may be passionate about issues they care about, but be hesitant to enter what is a very challenging environment. And I guess like communication wise is what we're getting at there. So what advice would you give someone who is autistic and is passionate, cares about these things that they want to have a voice in, but is unskilled in persuasive communication? And I have some thoughts there actually, but let me see first what you guys want to add, because maybe you'll touch on the things that I'm thinking about.
So I would say learn, because persuasive communication is part of the job in the political world. So whether you're someone who wants to run for office or you're someone who wants to be an effective advocate, you're going to have to learn how to be persuasive. And you can learn that formally or informally. There's a lot of classes out there. There's a lot of reading you can do, but it is a necessary part of the job. And if you're running for office, depending on what you're running for, so for example, for me to run for state representative, I needed to have campaign staff. And so I hired people who had a really great grasp on what was persuasive politically. Because, you know, at the end of the day, you could be advocating for incredible things, but if you cannot communicate the passion and persuasiveness in your voice and in your face and in your gestures and in the words and phrasing and emphasis that you use, it's not going to go anywhere. And so I think one of the reasons why I have been so successful in politics is because I've spent my entire adult life studying communication. I have bachelor's degrees in political science and in communication. I have a master's in communication, and I'm going to graduate this summer with my PhD in communication. And I always say I studied the thing that I did not have an intuitive grasp of. And so I have taken loads of public speaking classes. I've taken lots of classes and written research on persuasion. And so I think it's about learning. You got to learn it. You got to pick it up, no matter what part of politics you want to be involved in.
Yeah, well, and I love that the first thing you said, Representative Benham, is that if you're an autistic person who's not great with some element of communication, practice it and learn it. Because I think a lot of times, sometimes the neurotypical response is, well, that's too bad, find somebody else who can do it for you. And I completely agree with this idea that as an undergraduate, I studied human and organizational development because that was the thing in the world that baffled me most. It was like, I've got to figure this out. And it turned out it was the perfect major because it was a year of like human psychology and then how that applied to organizations and structures. And I was like, this is so fascinating. I never knew any of this. So anyway, yes.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not saying everybody has to go to college in communication. There are lots of free ways to learn on the internet, all kinds of, clubs that exist, like a Toastmasters, for example.
Oh my gosh, YouTube has every resource in the world for literally anything you'd want to learn.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. So, however you want to learn, however you want to pick it up, it's important. And, there are times where I wish persuading neurotypical people was not part of the job in politics. But I don't think that's going away anytime soon, because even if the world becomes more friendly to neurodiverse people, we're still a minority. And so we're still going to have to appeal to the majority in ways that they understand in order to accomplish what's best for our communities.
Yeah, I can see that PhD in communications coming through as you communicate with us. And Grace, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this too. And I would say, I only have one more question in the chat here, and then I'll have a sort of closing question. So yeah, you have plenty of time. Go on and give us your thoughts on this.
Okay. I would say just that persuasive communication isn't limited to verbal communication. So I think if you're someone who you have trouble speaking, just write it. Like if you're communicating to an office, you'll have the option to just write it by email. And most of the time, I think people prefer it too, to be honest. Or if you're like an ACC user, then communicate that way by all means necessary, because it really does not center around verbal communication. And unfortunately, there are a lot of difficulties that people who are ACC users face that speaking autistics like me don't really have to think about, like different stereotypes apply to them. And a lot of times, they're like, you can't bring your computer in here, or just different things like that. It's more likely that someone's going to talk to their support person instead of them.
Yeah, well, and Grace, I'm glad you point that out, because I had to confront a little piece of my own internalized ableism recently when we had a webinar where we included someone who used ACC and answered our questions that way. And I don't know if anyone knows Hari. He goes to UC Berkeley and is an outspoken autistic advocate, and he's so smart. And I have to say, he blew my expectations out of the water with how eloquent his speech was. And it didn't have to be coming out of his mouth. Those were his thoughts verbalized by his communication accommodation. And then I realized I had set my internal expectations lower for somebody who I knew was going to have to use this kind of middleman device to verbalize their thoughts. And I had this moment of wow, I can't do that. That's awful. And so there's also this place too, I guess, as we're trying to figure out what it looks like to communicate, where in our own community, we're analyzing what we think of other people and their ability. It's possible, I think, for autistic people to make assumptions about other autistic people that aren't fair. So I'm personally figuring that out, but I'm glad you bring that into the conversation, that it doesn't have to be verbal communication out loud, and it doesn't have to be traditional. the person doesn't have to speak with their own vocal cords to have a powerful voice. So anyway, Grace, was there anything else you wanted to add there? I know I have a tendency to jump in when I have a thought and just
No, your thoughts are always really good.
I will attribute that a little bit to the ADHD, because if I don't share what I'm thinking, it's very tough to hold on to it. But you did answer the question, and I really appreciate it. Our last question that is in the chat is for Representative Benham. Do you see politics as a career for you? This is my question too for you. We hope so. Yes, I agree with Tim. And he says you make great points about allies, taking a step back. But I mean, do you see yourself as someone who will make local and state politics a career, someone who could potentially want to lead on a different level, or someone who's taking it day by day? What do you imagine for your future?
Yeah, I mean, I think I've never really thought about this as a career, and more I think about it as a calling at the end of the day. I think sort of in the same way that, and maybe this comes from being a pastor's daughter, but my dad would never call being a pastor a career. He would think about it as a calling. And so I think that's the way that I think about this as as a call to service. So as long as I'm feeling that call, and as long as my community wants me to and keeps electing me, we do get elected every 2 years, so it's quick. Then I'll continue to serve in this role. And I love being a state representative. I really do. I can't imagine wanting to do anything other than this. I've got this great, very compact district that I represent that's roughly 60,000 people. I can make it from one end of it to the other in less than 20 minutes. And so it is the perfect size to be able to make it to all the different community events and to really get to know people. And so I love being a state rep. Not sure I'd want to be anything else.
Yeah, well, and there's something about the calling, and I related to what you said about Esther earlier, because as someone of faith who's grown up myself in the South in a Southern Baptist church, this whole idea that there is a moral or ethical element to being a leader in your community, and even to advocating for yourself and other autistic people. And I don't know, we often don't talk about any spiritual or ethical motivation for what we're doing, but I think it's absolutely true that whether you believe in creation or not, you are somebody who believes, if you're at this webinar, that autistic people are not broken. You're someone who believes that we are worth the space we take up, and our voices are worth being heard, and space should be made for us because of how we are made differently. So I appreciate too that you brought that perspective into this conversation, because really we don't talk as much about it. But anyway, okay, somehow we only have 2 minutes left. It has been so delightful to have Nicole set this event up and bring these people together, and also just to really get to know the two of you and your voices. I feel like I have gained, learned, benefited here. This is something we're going to place on YouTube for people to view after the fact. And so I have a closing question for you, and then afterwards, if you have time, feel free to hang around for a minute or two if anyone else has a question in the chat. But if not, we understand if you have to log off. I'll end the recording after this. But I would love to know, Grace, Representative Benham, how would you feel about joining some type of established forum group of female autistic leaders? Do you see there being some space where that is a group that can come together and have conversations? And should I attempt to initiate some sort of conversation among autistic women who are in some sort of leadership or advocacy? Is that something you'd ever be interested in being a part of?
I think that's a great idea. I mean, I will be honest that I have basically no spare time. So I don't know that I would necessarily personally have loads of time to participate in something like that, but I do think it's a really great idea. Networking.
Yeah. Well, and we do appreciate the hour you've given us today. This is very generous. Yeah. Grace, do you want to come join my autistic super women's group?
Yeah, I do. I've actually had a lot of other autistic superwomen that I know say they're like, oh, I know Claire.
Yes. Well, I realized we have a good mutual friend. So if y'all don't know Haley Moss, you need to look her up. She is super cool. But that one person, I think we have both been close to. So, well, I want to have future conversations about and among autistic leaders, and particularly the women in this space who have that intersectional experience. So do not be surprised if you hear from myself or the Frisk Center in the future about conversations like that, whether they be, an ongoing chat space or some type of event months down the road. But I really appreciate all of you. I especially appreciate Nicole, Representative Benham, and Grace for being here. And I'm going to let you guys go to be respectful of whatever is on your calendar next, but I'll hang around for just a moment in case anyone has a question or would like to grab my email to follow up about anything we've talked about today. So I'm going to end the recording now. Bye, everybody.
Thanks so much, Claire, and everyone else. Thanks, Nicole.
Thank you. It was nice liking to hear, and I like the webinar. So seeing you.